So, hello, Faith.
Hi, Annie. How are you?
I am great. I am recovered from COVID, so I have full Jolty energy at the moment.
Good. And you took that Paxlovid, right?
Paxlovid, yes.
Paxlovid, and that helped you, right?
Well, I think so. And I like some drugs have really crappy names, but Pax is peace, and then it has the Ovid from COVID. So it's a nice neologism, I think. Some drugs are impossible to pronounce. Paxlovid seems pretty cool. Yeah, it did seem to work for me. Yes.
Yeah. I think Lexapro sounds nice.
Lovely.
And Valium sounds lovely. And
yeah, it's true. And Halcyon, one of my favorites.
Halcyon. What about Percocet?
Exactly.
Very
That's
pretty.
Good. Yes.
And what about ketamine?
It's good. A little ketamine bounce.
Yeah. Okay.
It's all better than kaopectate.
For sure. Or Colace.
Yes. Today we have Dr. Richard Firshein, who is an expert in all things integrative medicine, longevity-based, nutritional-based, looking at the microbiome, looking at all the things that people can do to stay healthier using the best of Eastern and Western medicine. He runs a integrative wellness center not far from you, Faith, on the Upper East Side. He's seen 25,000 patients. That's a lot of people. We'll have to ask him how his memory is about each one of them.
We have to ask him how old he is. My God, that's a lot of patients.
He looks pretty young. Maybe that's a testament to his, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And he's incredibly empathetic and smart and at the leading edge of the frontiers of medicine. So I think it's going to be a great conversation because you and I are both obsessively interested in all things wellness related and longevity related. And where is the future taking us? We've had a lot of guests on this subject, and I think Richard is going to be a great capper to those experiences that we've had.
Have you ever gone to see him?
I have not gone to see him, but I did get some free advice about COVID-related transmission.
And what did he say?
Well, exactly. When Flora tested, I wore a mask, being paranoid and Jewish. And then when I tested, I said, I'll just take off the mask. But then I said, well, wait a minute. We're each shedding, and we each have a viral load. Why would we want to make the other one potentially worse? So I asked him if we should put the mask back on, and he replied, good idea.
Okay.
I know you're like cynical about all that, right?
Well, it's not that I'm cynical. It's that I'm sure it works for people. It's just a lot. And, I had COVID so early in the game in March 2020. And I came out to the country and I was very fortunate because I could have everybody outdoors. Made them more comfortable.
But the COVID you had in those early days, that COVID has gone from the earth, basically. So the new variants will see you as fresh meat, fresh immune meat.
That'll be interesting, but it won't be interesting, so I can't say that. I think Cece got it in Europe, my little one.
You told me.
Yeah, and she came back.
Yeah.
But she got rid of it very fast. But every time you say shedding, I think you're a dog. I hate to say.
Well,
I don't like to think of skin cells as one of my least favorite things.
Well, the shedding is not skin cells. The shedding is the virus in the nose.
Well, it feels like there are cells involved.
So, but you were telling me before our guests were fortunate enough to listen in on us that you worry about stepping into the pothole.
Yeah.
So COVID is just one big immune pothole.
So is anxiety. So is all of it. I do have a lot of things to ask him because I've been reading so much about, I don't know if it has a real name, but where they take a tight scan of your head and then they put on these things, and I don't know what they do. They reconnect your broken synapses.
Right.
And then you're all healthy and happy again. I want to know.
TNS.
Yeah, but there's a more forward one, I think, a newer one. We can ask him. I think that sounds good to me.
I think using electrical impulses, in this case, to restore areas of the brain that have been damaged from a variety of factors.
Trauma,
yes. PTSD, long COVID, anxiety, Parkinson's, all sorts of neurological issues. Yeah, it works. There's no doubt about it. It's going to get better and better and better because we'll learn with more precision what parts of the brain need to be zapped for what condition.
So shouldn't we do this, Patty?
Yes.
We have to make a date. We should go and do it. We should ask him who's the best at this.
A zap date.
Yeah, a zap date. Yep. We should definitely do this.
Well, I forgot his name because I need a shot. We had a guest on. Remember you met him at his facility?
Yeah, he does it. Yeah,
he does it.
He does it. And he restored a good friend of mine's husband out of a 2-year stay-in-bed depression.
Right. Intractable depression.
He's still an introvert, though.
But he got out of bed.
He did, and he went to work.
Really?
But he still doesn't like parties.
But what was he before he became bedbound? Was he an extrovert?
No. Do you consider yourself an introvert or an extrovert?
Like many people, I'm a cop-out hybrid. I think it depends. I can be, like you, I think. I think there are moments when I'm sort of motivated to be outside myself, and then moments where I'll just not want to talk to anybody, really.
You're bivert.
Yes, good. Or an omnivert.
An omnivert. I think I'm an extrovert, I've decided, that gets tired sometimes and has to lie down.
Well, you could still feel full of a desire to connect in a prone position.
I can, but nobody wants to come over.
But do you think you feed off people, the energy of people?
For sure. With extreme abandonment issues, too. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you reach out to people on email, let's say, and they should write back to you, but they don't, how quickly do you say screw it and you drop it, or how much do you obsess over what happened?
No, I never think. I have to say, you may have given me something new now, but I don't think of email that way. If they don't write, most of our emails are business related, so I think that maybe they're not ready for us. I don't have any personal emails, hardly any.
Really?
That are not, no.
Right.
And we answer emails in 8 minutes or less. Now, very few people answer that fast. I mean, especially to clients,
That's a good tagline. The answers may not be good, but you get them in 8 minutes or less.
So less, right? But no, I assume that they're confused. I don't even think about it, but now that you're making me think about it, I think they're confused, busy, otherwise occupied. That has very little to do with me. If it's a business one, I think they don't want to, engage that way right now.
Right.
Email is, I think, dead. I think email is a dead, what do you call it, communication system.
Protocol.
Terrible. Nobody wants it. Nobody wants to read it, and nothing good comes out of it. And it's mainly designed for people covering their asses in corporate America.
Well, a lot of it is that, but what about Slack?
Yeah, I never got into Slack. Is that good?
So a lot of my clients are using Slack, and they have me on the Slack channel. I don't particularly like Slack. I think everybody...
How does it go? How's it going? You enter your...
It's synchronous. It's synchronous. It's a big, giant, endless thread. It's like it's like the Talmud. And everybody... It's like Google Docs. I personally hate the Google Doc model.
Why?
Because everybody's opinion is considered equal, And everybody feels obligated to contribute to the Google Doc, because if they don't, it feels like they're not doing their work. So you get 1,000 comments.
Oh, it's terrible. I like it between two people, though. Sometimes you're working on something.
2 people building, yes. But now when you have 10 people on a Google Doc.
Terrible.
Well, it's unusual for a physician to be in the waiting room, so maybe we should show them what it feels like. Just kidding, Richard.
That's very cute.
So
I have to say, we should have a comedy show. Okay, so you go, Addie.
No, go. I was just going to say, let us now bring Richard in from the proverbial waiting room and let the fireworks begin.
I'm going to let Adam ask the first questions because he found you, and that's only polite.
Well, we found each other actually, but hey, Richard, good to see you. Of course.
Great to see you.
Maybe you could just introduce yourself. We gave you a little setup in our preamble, but I think it'd be great if you introduce yourself to our guests. I mean, you've got an amazing practice that you've built. You've treated so many patients, 25,000, maybe 25,001 since you updated your website. And how did you take this path of integrative medicine, and what brought you here?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had this is original memories. I wanted to be a doctor, and my family history was riddled with health problems. So, cancer, heart disease. I grew up with asthma as a child and missed a lot of school, was always sick. And there really wasn't a lot of treatments available at the time. So I have been on this journey to understand my own health and the health of the people I cared about. I really had to deal with a lot of personal tragedy growing up. I had 2 best friends when I was 10 and 14 died from lymphoma and leukemia.
God.
And it was a strange time. My mother had breast cancer. My father had heart disease. A lot of cancer in the family, melanomas and so forth. So I was really surrounded by medicine, whether I wanted to be or not. And I needed to get answers. And at the time, growing up, there really wasn't a lot. There was a lot of fear around cancer. There was a lot of unknowns around heart disease, but nobody really had a good understanding of what it was and what the options were. And I remember growing up, around, radio broadcasts from Carlton Fredericks. And he was like, he was a regular. My mom was a big advocate. And I, later on, of course, I became much more involved in the alternative medicine world because I really couldn't find answers in the traditional. And that's sort of how it all unfolded. I got to work with the late Bob Atkins and watched his progression as an alternative. At that time, we used to call it alternative medicine, not integrative medicine or functional medicine, which are the more common words that we use these days. But that's sort of how, that early progression began.
Just a little further background, teeny bit more. The kind of patients and conditions that you treat for. I know you're an acupuncturist, right, as well?
Yeah, so I really have a very broad-based practice. I enjoy treating a lot of different conditions. I would say the things that people typically have the most problem with are chronic pain, chronic fatigue, chronic allergies, little offshoots of those conditions like Epstein-Barr and Lyme disease. But, everything morphs into something else. So people end up with cancer or heart disease, diabetes. And so once you treat someone holistically, they come in for something, but that's not what you end up really focusing on. So if people come in, I know they have a problem. It's why they want me to see them. But at the end of it, I have my own goalpost. And I, when someone comes in, I know this is what they're manifesting. But then once you understand people are on kind of a train ride and it starts at birth and you can predict with a certain degree of certainty what kinds of problems they'll manifest. Once you understand their genetics, their predispositions, their lifestyle, their diet, their allergies, their family history. Once you understand it, you know pretty much where they're going. And if you are able to predict that, then you're able to get them on the right track. Most people, end up on a certain path, and so they'll start off, as a child, they're on a lot of antibiotics, and they develop a lot of allergies, and then their immune system's weakened, and then they start having problems with hormones or chronic fatigue and Epstein-Barr. Then they develop other underlying conditions. It could be chronic sinusitis, and it just keeps going. And so you have to head it off at the pass. And so what I try to do is I tell people, people are very familiar with the idea of staying in their lane. So I really try to get people into their health lane, and once they stay within those parameters, I use different modalities. So acupuncture was sort of an outgrowth of my practice. After I was in practice for about 15 years, I worked in an office with an acupuncturist, and he was fantastic. I would see people come in, they had terrible problems. And so with acupuncture treatments, they were able to really upgrade their health and really change their health. And from that point, I studied medical acupuncture at UCLA, and then I became a medical acupuncturist. And what acupuncture did teach me, every piece of medicine teaches you something really critical. And acupuncture opened my eyes to the idea of energetics, and that we are energy, that our bodies are made of energy, that we're created from energy, and that acupuncture taps into this very profound mechanism, this idea of chi and blockages, and how we overcome those. And so acupuncture really gave me great insights into how nutraceuticals work, how pharmaceuticals work, how patients work, because once you understand the energetics of how we live and what weakens us, you're able to build on that. And acupuncture is a very powerful bridge. It's one of the tools and one of the modalities that I utilize, but it's a very powerful one.
So what about this thing? Hattie knows about it, because we interviewed somebody on this, where they take a very detailed brain scan.
Yes.
And then they find disconnects. I'm saying it in very...
No, TNS.
Right.
But its ability to address a lot of the conditions you treat.
Yeah, but beyond TN, even more advanced maybe than that?
Yes, and I think where we're going now is these kind of electromagnetic pulse therapies, and the idea of combining these different modalities. But they are, in some way, they do create maybe different pathways than acupuncture when you're using high dose or high impulse energetics. But it is a similar idea in that we're trying to rebalance. There's some imbalance in how you function, and we're trying to recreate or redirect those pathways. On the medical side, we're using a lot in my practice now. We're using, ketamine and psychedelics for the same reason, is that you're creating new pathways and new energetic pathways to help the body and help the organism to reestablish itself and to get it back to what its normal is, or to use it, another pathway on it.
One step backwards on this method about reconnecting broken pathways because of trauma, that are producing, because of trauma, producing depression, other things. Have you seen that work?
Yes. I have patients who were suicidal. Ketamine is the only thing that saved them. I have patients who microdose psilocybin. It's the thing that has worked better than any antidepressant they've been on.
Okay, wait a minute. I was really asking about that brain thing, but you're saying ketamine. Tell us about ketamine. Take a few minutes.
Well, right now we're sort of in the informative stage. This is an anesthetic that was, subject to some amount of abuse. And what we did, though, find out over time is that ketamine is a drug that, what I was mentioning earlier, potentially creates new pathways. And when I say that, I mean that, we know that 90% of our brain capacity is underutilized. So the secret is not necessarily to find treatments that enhance what we already have, which is when you think about drugs like SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those are drugs that increase the amount of serotonin, what we think of as the hormone, a neurotransmitter that enhances good feelings, to put it in common layman's terms. So what you're doing is you're increasing serotonin, but if you're really supplying something that the body may have, or it may be a neurotransmitter that is not the functional reason why someone is dealing with depression, what you're trying to do is to create a new pathway. And it appears that neurons are stimulated, new neurons are stimulated, new pathways are stimulated when you use these psychotropic or psychedelics. And, it starts with, natural substances like psilocybin, obviously magic mushrooms. But it's one of the things that it's always fascinated me about the use of natural compounds, that you can get so much benefit. Ketamine is a very powerful drug, but you can get so much benefit from using nutraceuticals, herbal remedies, things that we find in nature to get most of the people most of the way. Again, you have powerful drugs for powerful reasons and for important reasons, but there also there's this other part of the conversation where you're looking at diet, you're looking at supplements, and you're saying, okay, we're using these pharmaceuticals to create new pathways. How can we do that naturally as well? And that's the conversation we were talking about earlier. We were discussing integrative health and how you combine both of these modalities into one practice.
Richard, when you're looking at your patients and trying to keep them in their lane, as you put it, and undo a lot of injury that happened because of diet, nutrition, and so forth, do you look at biological age and chronological age and use biomarkers and then use that to track progress against the goal?
Yes. I think one of the things that happens in again, in a medical practice versus in when you're using an idea, about, when we're thinking about what's someone's chronological age or the metabolic age. And, I always hear people talking about they reverse their age, 30 years and so forth.
Right.
I think, there are specific markers for that, true age, glycan age. Look at different markers. Some of them are damage that occurs to the cells. Others are methylation markers. But there's a lot of nuance to that also, because there's a lot of ways that we predict age. And so I think it's interesting to understand your biological age versus your chronological age. But it's also important to really look at all the factors that go into making you who you are. So when you talk about traumas, when you talk about injuries, those may not show up on a typical, let's say, methylation profile. You might see, there's this marker, this epigenetic marker that tells me what kind of injury I'm causing on a day-to-day basis. But you have to measure it against the actual changes that you are seeing on the test. So, for instance, I will look at methylation markers, and they're valuable. But I'll also want to make sure that I'm going through a very careful checklist in terms of the things that actually cause mortality that lead to aging, and that ultimately are the mechanisms that are activated when those causes of aging are either interrupted or the causes of aging are accelerated.
Right.
And so you have to have a big, broader picture of that.
Are there signals of all-cause mortality that you think are more important than other people think are important and that you think are underappreciated when you look at a patient holistically?
Yes. And so I make sure when I do a series of tests that I'm looking at things that I feel, number one, when I'm looking at mortality and morbidity. So there's a period in between what we think of as your lifespan and your health span, right? So most people think about it and they say, yeah, there's that period of time in between, and but your lifespan is your lifespan. That's finite, and your health span usually, statistically, is about 60, let's say 63, before people start having a lot of health problems, and then we have a lifespan which generally goes to about 80, now, which we know has been becoming less over the last few years, but which is a part of the conversation and why we're having it. We understand the causes of aging, but we're having difficulty, with implementing it. So the issue really is, what's that period in between your health span and your lifespan, and how do we increase that? How do we make sure that we've dealt with it? So yes, there are specific markers that tell you a lot about where someone's health is. And there are some simple things that I think are really underappreciated. C-reactive protein, for instance, is one, but HS, or high.
Wait, so you have to explain what that is, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So CRP stands for C-reactive protein, and it's a biological marker. There's a high sensitivity CRP, which tells you circulating in the blood, sedimentation rate was sort of an earlier version, but it tells you basically how fast inflammation is occurring at any time in your body. And so it's like a temperature. It's like a test you could do that tells you what your inflammatory temperature is.
I'm smiling. I'm smiling, Faith, and Richard, because in our book, Dictionary of the Future, Faith knows what I'm going to say before I say it. In terms of, this was written 22 years ago, like, what will people be focusing on? C-reactive protein as an entry in the book. So,
and it's amazing how, when I go back to, and I've been using, because I'm saying that something is underappreciated, it doesn't mean it hasn't been around for a long time.
Right.
When I wrote my second book, which is The Nutraceutical Revolution, which is now celebrating its 25th anniversary.
Wow. Congratulations.
When I went through the book, because I'm going through the entire book now and putting together another edition of the book, the nutraceuticals, because there are a lot of new nutraceuticals that are available. But when I went through the material in the book, I was both excited and it was a little bit sad, right? Because all the things that I felt would be available and understood and utilized, 25 years ago, and, you write books 28 years ago, I just thought it would be common, that everybody would understand that we'd all be, looking for these things in foods, we would have everything that we needed, and it would be available, the research would be there. And of course, here we are, and I'm looking back, and it's kind of, it blows your mind, right? Now, I see something, someone will say, what do you think is a hot supplement on, TikTok? And they're talking about quercetin, or they're talking about magnesium, or they're talking, everything was in the book. It's all there, the same. And so really right now, what I'm doing is updating that information. So it's current, but I'm updating the research, which basically says, yes, what we knew before was true, and we just have more data to support it, which is fantastic, and that's how science should be. But I think that that's sort of the idea behind things that I look at, that I feel like I wrote in that book about MTHFR and C-reactive protein as well. I mean, these were tests that I was doing.
What is MTHFR?
Okay. So MTHFR is a specific gene that is involved in methionine metabolism. And methionine is a critical amino acid in terms of energy production and inflammation. If you lack, we were talking earlier about methylation, for instance. So what the methionine pathway does is it methylates homocysteine. And homocysteine is an inflammatory compound that's been linked to strokes and heart disease and cardiovascular disease. It is literally a factor in vitamin B12 deficiency and why it can cause a lot of problems. It has a nickname also, which I won't say here, but MTHFR is one of those genes that regulates inflammation, and it is preventable. So if you take a methylated vitamin, so now we're talking about methylation again, but if you methylate, let's say B12, and you have a deficiency in B vitamins and you can't metabolize them because you're unable to methylate, you can actually take a methylated B12, methylated folate, and that eliminates the problem for people that test themselves and look into whether or not they have this specific gene. Now, some people have one gene, some people have both. The real problem is for people that actually are what we call homozygous, which means they have a methylated, a gene for MTHFR, both in the mother and the father. So when they inherit it, both genes are present, and that creates the highest risk profile for that. But it's another example of where we're going. And when I talk about how all of this comes together, we're really looking at what your inflammatory markers are, what your genetic markers are, what your metabolic markers are, whether or not you have allergies, whether or not you have environmental exposures, whether there's other factors in your life, personal factors, whether or not you're sleeping well, whether or not you have, whether you're getting enough exercise and so forth. So I really look at about 21 different parameters that give me that overview, but methylation and problems and genetic markers such as MTHFR are one of them.
I was just going to ask about what we were discussing earlier, which is what are you telling your patients about alcohol?
I think at this point, when I was in medical school, there was no, the science at that point said there was no good amount of alcohol. It's a long time now, so we're 40 years, going back 40 years, but that was the state of the art then. There was some research that came out afterwards that seemed to suggest that moderate alcohol consumption was cardioprotective. And I think a lot of times when you hear good news around something where there's, a commodity such as, alcoholic beverages that people like to consume, it's nice to have a feel-good feeling and a feel-good story around it. There is a significant difference between how alcohol is metabolized for men and women. Alcohol significantly raises estrogen levels because it works as an anesthetic. So it actually anesthetizes the liver. It stops a detoxification pathway. You get a buildup of specific toxins. And that's more significant for women because they're going to raise their estrogen, and that creates more of a problem in terms of risk factors for cancer, for instance. I think where we are now is, as with everything, another buzzword these days is precision-based medicine. We have to really take all these factors into account. And so when I say I look at all these factors for each individual, I really am trying to understand what that person's genetic predispositions are. If someone has a high risk of cancer, their estrogen levels trend high, and they're consuming a lot of alcohol, it is going to add to their risk factors. It's likely that one drink or less than one drink, and it takes about an hour for your liver to metabolize 1 ounce of alcohol. So it's likely that that 1 ounce of alcohol consumed slowly over that hour is probably a fairly low risk and may reduce the risk of heart disease in people that are prone to problems with their heart that are related to stress, right? So if it reduces your stress, you feel better with it, you have a drink, it probably reduces your risk. I think beyond that, the problem with alcohol is just that it reduces your ability to detoxify. It increases permeability in your gut.
Wait, what do you mean permeability in your gut?
So we have, there's another kind of buzzword that's out there called leaky gut. And basically leaky gut and increased intestinal permeability are the same. Basic. When we say it, what we're saying is that in the gut, there are cells, columnar cells, and there are cells that there are junctions in between the cells called tight junctions. Those tight junctions are where after food is metabolized, your body absorbs nutrients into the portal vein, and then it gets delivered to the liver. And, whatever viruses, bacteria, toxins that were absorbed are processed, and then the raw materials are then released into the body. What happens with leaky gut or decreased intestinal permeability is the tight junctions don't function as well. The single cell barrier, and it really is just one cell between your gut and your bloodstream, that barrier becomes disrupted. So if you consume alcohol, it damages the barrier. Gluten also can damage the barrier, particularly for people that are sensitive to gluten, who have antibodies that increase the risk of celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. And so when you absorb those compounds, when you absorb toxins, when you absorb food that you shouldn't, you increase the risk of allergies, you increase the risk of toxins, of being exposed to bacteria and viruses. So alcohol damages that lining. And because it damages the lining, it increases permeability. So now you're getting things into your bloodstream that you wouldn't normally if you drink too much. And that's the gastritis that people feel, when you get a hangover. There are certain things that people feel. They tend to feel nauseous. They get headaches. They get fatigued, but part of the GI side effect is because of the local toxicity of alcohol.
So this thing about the gut is the new brain? I mean...
Yes.
Can you talk a few about that?
Yes. So your gut basically actually contains cells that are very similar to the cells you find in your brain. There is a direct communication between the vagal nerve and your brain. 70% of the serotonin, we talked earlier about serotonin and depression, and it's the feel-good hormone. 70% of the serotonin you produce is produced by bacteria in your gut. So we're learning that trillions of bacteria in our gut, at this point, there are more cells in your gut than cells in your body. It might be 10 or 20 times the number of bacteria on a cellular basis that are present in your gut than are present in your entire body. Those cells basically don't know that they're in your body. They think you are around them. And they eat first. We chew the food, they digest the food, and they break it down with enzymes. We absorb what they don't consume. They release a lot of chemicals and a lot of nutrients that we can't produce. Like B12, for instance, is produced by bacteria. Either that, or we have to consume red meat, because that's how cows actually produce B12, is because their gut turns what they're consuming, that, let's say, the grasses that they're consuming, and the bacteria in their gut are able to turn some of those nutrients into B12. We consume red meat, and that's how we get B12. Or we get it through our own processes of bacterial digestion. The problem is that if if the gut biome is off and these trillions of bacteria aren't working together, you take too many antibiotics. I mean, there are some antibiotics, what we call the broad spectrum antibiotics, that can take up to, 1 or 2 years to replace those gut bacteria. So we talk about the gut biome, we're using, these very powerful tools to eradicate infections in our body. But in our gut, those bacteria, which can number over 1,000 different strains, can actually become quite depleted. And we use those bacteria for nutrients. We use it for neurotransmitter production. We use it to prevent cancer. We use it to prevent heart disease. There's a very symbiotic relationship that's developed over millions of years between the bacteria that we have inside us that are passed along, in many cases, generation to generation, that were highly protective. And when we lose that, we lose our natural barrier against disease. We lose the natural way that our body prevents problems with malabsorption and maldigestion. And then we end up increasing the risk of a lot of diseases because we don't have this source of natural protection. And it's why probiotics are, such a buzzword too, because they do provide an enormous benefit, but they need to be taken in the context of how many bacteria that we're actually trying to replace when we lose them.
You're not saying that we have to eat red meat to keep healthy in our gut, are you?
No. And in fact, there's another type of organism that lives in our gut, which processes red meat and turns it into a toxin. So in fact, there are definitely reasons not to eat red meat. What I am saying, though, is that the reason why cows contain, when we consume them, why we get the benefits of what they eat, part of it is that their gut bacteria converts what they eat partially into this very critical nutrient. And one of the only ways to get it is through red meat. A lot of people, what happens is there are people who, let's say, consume red meat all their lives and then they become vegetarian. The natural process, meaning the bacteria that they've unleashed, that they're harnessing, those bacteria are related to the foods you're consuming. So if you consume something and you don't need it, then you don't produce it yourself. And so a lot of people make the transition from being a carnivore to a vegetarian. And then at that point, they don't get they're not able to actually, they don't have the bacteria to break it down or produce.
Okay, so if you don't eat red meat, just talking about myself, what do you recommend then?
Well, number one, get a simple blood test and check to see, because you might have adapted at this point. Many people do.
What am I checking for?
You do a B12 level. So just check B12 and folate. And that'll,
yeah, mine was fine.
And if those numbers are normal, then you're good.
Okay. Because I don't want you to be promoting, you're not really promoting eating red meat, because do you think that's healthy for us, the kind of red meat we get?
No, I think that it's more important to, for people to understand how we function and how disrupted our food supply is, and how poorly our diets have conformed to, what we consume and what we need. So when I say B12, I'm saying there are some people, just, from a medical point of view, because again, people come into me and my job is to optimize their health. I might have some other motivations that I feel are important, protecting the planet and, reducing our consumption of red meat is a critical goal. But at the same time, there are just some people who they just can't get it. So I first try with supplements, and you can get perfectly fine B12 supplements for people who are deficient, and it works great. But it's important also to understand that if you are a vegetarian, and I see these things all the time. I have, people that eat red meat and don't eat vegetables, and it drives me crazy because, everybody knows the truth at this point, right? It's like, it's very hard.
So I'm asking you, it drives you crazy, but you just say why. And I know a lot of people, they eat red meat, no vegetables, no plants. So tell me why it drives you crazy.
Well, without the things that nourish, for instance, we're talking about the gut biome, the things that nourish your gut biome, for the most part, are things that healthy bacteria will grow on. So we know there are prebiotics, and when we say a prebiotic could be fiber, soluble and insoluble fibers. And each one of them has a very specific bacteria that they attract. And when you eat red meat, you're consuming, all the toxins from the meat. You're not creating diversity in your gut. You are consuming a product that, for many other reasons, but it's not a great diet for environmental reasons. But on the medical side, it just, it'll contribute to heart disease, contributes to cancer, creates a poor gut biome, increases your risk of most diseases. And it does not really do much than make people feel good at the time they're eating it.
So you mentioned Bob Atkins before. So
that was an interesting time. The thing that I took away from Bob Atkins, and what I immediately changed because I didn't like the diet, and I didn't like the part of the diet which focused on red meat and bacon and butter
and
cheese,
right. And but what I did see while I spent time with him was that people were losing weight because they were on a carb restricted diet. And when you're battling two sides, it really was two sides of the same coin, because you had, the meat industry, and you have the carb industry, and they were both promoting things that were terrible, right? So you took people off sugar, and they suddenly lost weight, and it was a major revelation. I mean, at the time he was called before Congress. He was, lost his license, really for saying that carbs were the problem. He had his own biases, and when I saw that, I was like, there is a middle ground here. We really could eat a healthy diet that doesn't have sugar and doesn't have red meat. And that's the focus of my practice for really the last 40 years.
He was probably a necessary step in the journey to enlightenment.
He was. He was a necessary step, because he was that step for me where I was, at the time when there weren't a lot of people doing integrative medicine in New York. And he was a necessary step for me, because I realized it's like, okay, this is the carb diet everyone's talking about. This is the meat diet. It doesn't make sense. We need a healthy diet. And so that did make a big difference.
So you don't believe in
pure keto,
the no carb diet?
I am not a fan of a diet that doesn't promote what I think is the specific health lane for my patients. So it may be that there is a case where I come across a patient, and the only thing that I can do is put them on a diet which is, let's say fish and, salad, or something that is protein and, and where they're having minimal carbs. They lose weight. And part of it is because, they're having a healthy diet. Yeah, they're having a salad, and I'm getting them, to eat something that I feel comfortable with. So it in that sense, they're on a low carb diet. I'm just on a it's on a high nutritional value, omega-3s, high quality protein, and salads and.
I have a question. I always let Addie have the last question, so don't worry, Addie.
No.
So here's my question. So we've been looking for a magic pill for centuries about losing weight, right? And guess what? Ozempic, Moderna, Wegovy comes along. And I'd love to know what you think about that. Generally, for obesity, for people that just want to lose 20, etc.
So, I was using Ozempic off-label for a while before it came on the market as a obesity drug. And I saw the benefits. I also saw the downside. And so I think it's a great tool in the toolbox. And I think...
Wait, what was the downside?
So the downside is people develop problems over time. So they will get, if you're not careful, and then these are things that have come out in the news, increased risk of gallbladder disease, pancreatitis, digestive disorders, reflux. I think those would be sort of 3 things that are fairly well documented at this point and understood. So the problem is with a lot of treatments, and particularly where I see big companies who've really got on the bandwagon, is they don't really understand, how to use the drug most effectively, because you have to be on a good diet before you go on the drug. A lot of people just stick with what they're doing, and they are, well, this is fantastic. I've lost my appetite. I don't need to eat anymore. And then the minute they go off it, they're going to have a problem. You have to train yourself once before you go on to be healthy, and then once you're on it, you have to have an exit strategy. I often talk to my patients. I said, it's easy to go into something. It's very hard to get off of it. And most drugs are like that. Most drugs people take, and they say, the question people ask, why am I going to have to be on this the rest of my life? And yes, if you're not careful, you will be. And I don't think the benefits over time, we've been down this diet drug route many times. This one looks a little bit better, but I would say, there should be an expiration date where you take it if you're using it for weight loss. Where you have a strategy in place, you have an exit strategy, what your diet looks like, exercise, you worked on your sleep, the things, you're reducing stress. Those are the things that cause weight gain. And so you want to make sure that you're using a powerful and expensive drug. It's an amazing conversation we're having, right? It's a drug that's $1,000 a month. Right. And we're having this incredible conversation over something that is an exorbitantly priced medication for losing pounds that you probably can lose a good chunk of it with, the proper diet and all the factors that I mentioned.
Yeah, so for sure.
It's a big advance. I think, one of the things I do want to mention, because I know you're a futurist, I think we're living in an incredible time right now. If I were to say, from my own perspective, it's the most exciting time to be practicing medicine and to be alive to receive those benefits. We really are at the cusp of changes that I've been waiting my whole career to see. And I do think that the advances we'll be making will make the kinds of treatments, kinds of things we've done over the last 50 years pale by comparison. So I appreciate the question, because I do think the drug is on the right path. I do think, though, that we don't want to throw out the baby, in this case, with the bathwater, because, at the end of the day, there's just certain things you have to do to stay healthy. And it's a mistake to go on a medication and think that that's somehow going to be a drug you can take for the next 40 years and it's going to be perfect.
even if you can, it doesn't really, if you're going to eat it, I know people that eat against it.
Yes.
They take it and they eat against it. It doesn't work.
No. It is a, again, when I see, people prescribing it and without the oversight, because, people buy it online and so forth, I look at it and I'm like, it's a train wreck. It's a disaster, and I think that's, we've been down this road so many times before that it's hard to believe that somehow we're walking into this one thinking, yep, we figured this one out.
Magic pill.
We got it.
We always do.
Addie.
Yeah. So I was just to build on that for the last question, because you did mention $1,000 a month, and some of it sometimes is covered, sometimes it isn't, and we are at the cusp, I believe, of a huge revolution. But will that revolution be available to enough people? I mean, we've seen the healthcare divide that was illuminated by COVID. So how concerned are you that the gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of medical access is something that we're not prepared to address as a society?
I think it's a significant problem. I think the therapeutics will certainly get more expensive, because when we're talking about biologics, they're very sophisticated therapeutics. However, because of the demand and over time, when you do have people who can afford these drugs, like, it's like plasma TVs. I mean, just $40,000. Now you basically get one for $300. I think this medication, at some point, it'll be off patent. It will be available for next to nothing. But I also think that a lot of the drug companies will seek to create better and better versions that will be more accessible to the masses. So
they also tweak the patents, though, too, right? They play with the patents to extend the patentability with a slight modification.
I do think that
to the
that's
chemistry.
Cynical.
I do think
they do.
Yeah, I do think that it is a problem. But I also do recommend to my patients before they come in, because obviously it's on everyone's tip of everyone's tongue, and I say, do these things. Listen, as I said, I saw people lose lots of weight on restricted diets. It is a little bit harder, but your body does get used to it. And I do think, we haven't had time to really go into each one of these topics is really fascinating on their own, because, intermittent fasting, ketogenic diets, like what's the best way for people to modify their diet so they get benefit. After a few days of fasting, you lose the taste for a lot of sweets and sugar, and you will tend to lose weight. And if you do take the time, you don't need these medications, or if you need them for a tune-up. And I think that's the best advice I can give. There's certainly other supplements that are less expensive. There are diets that are better. There are ways to find out about inflammation. We talked about C-reactive protein. People are literally overweight because they have a lot of inflammation. And suddenly, someone goes on a diet and it's a healthy diet, they lose weight, and they're like, wow, I just lost 10 pounds. Well, a lot of it was just inflammation that they were carrying. And they're just so surprised about that. The other downside with Ozempic, and I did want to mention it, is it does appear that, once you go on a diet, this is true for yo-yo dieting, where people go on and off diets. Every time you go on a diet, you don't just lose fat. There's this idea, someone will show you, like, here's what 5 pounds of fat looks like, right? I remember there was a doctor I knew who had that on his desk. It's like, if you lose that weight, this is what you're losing. But that's not how dieting works. You lose, 60% fat or 70% fat, but 30% of it is muscle. And so you have to be vigilant about exercising while you're on these medications, because it appears that when you're on them, you lose more muscle and you lose more fat. So instead of it being, let's say, a 70-30 split, for argument's sake, where you lose 70% fat, 30% muscle, you lose, let's say, 50-50 on these medications. And I think that's troubling, because we know that the key to longevity, and we've talked about this quite a bit, the keys to longevity, one of them is whether or not you can maintain your muscle mass, sarcopenia. And, here we are having a conversation about risk factors, reducing the risk of heart disease and diabetes and weight as an independent risk factor is significant. But if you're losing muscle, you're creating an entirely new risk factor that you didn't have before. And that's another caveat I would let people know about in addition to the risks.
But Richard, I know that you would agree that the insurance companies, that obesity is definitely a killer, let's say,
right,
especially at 300 and 400, even 280, 250,
right,
and they're not covering even Ozempic or Mounjaro or Wegovy or whatever. Why?
Well, it is just too expensive. And I think that insurance companies, it's interesting because this, again, is a philosophical problem. But when you think about insurance, if you have a car accident, the insurance company isn't paying you, and they'll pay you a little bit to be a good driver. But what you're paying for is if your car hits a tree and then they need to fix the car. So they're in the business of taking care of problems after there's an accident. And traditional medical care and insurance, the idea of insurance is against a problem. Like, you're being insured against a tornado or a hurricane. You're not being insured, if you keep your house.
It's not a pre-tornado.
Yes. No one's saying, wow, you did, what a great job you did painting your house. They're saying, well, if your house gets blown away, we'll rebuild your house. So insurance companies have a little bit of an incentive not to keep people healthy because the problem for the most part is in people's hands, right? They're not healthy because they go out and they have a bag of potato chips when they shouldn't, or they don't exercise, or they don't get enough sleep, and they're not taking the time to understand the role that stress plays. So there's a lot of problems with insurance companies, and I'm not saying they're not saints. What I'm saying is that, this is a very expensive drug that which a lot could be prevented, meaning people could do a lot to prevent themselves from putting on a certain amount of weight. Not all of it, but some of it.
But to your point about people eating against it, so I think the insurance companies will look at the actuarial pieces and say, will the drug create what they call a moral hazard, which is if you're protected against it, you'll eat more, and at the end of the day, they won't benefit from reduced claims because people
do you really think that they're thinking that?
Oh yeah, they do. They have thousands of people sitting there just figuring out the math here.
Is that why you think that they don't cover it?
I don't think they have enough data. I think they look at the data, and they don't have enough data to say, what is the end? How many people are going to be on this drug for how long? What are the reduced claims? Now, life insurance is different, but health insurance, they're just going to look at the data and say, will it reduce the claim burden on my actuarial tables? And they don't know yet. So
they know that if it reduces obesity, it would reduce the claims.
No, but long term, though, to your point, will people lose the weight, keep it off? What other side effects may emerge? Look, if the insurance company knew that they could spend $12,000 a year and save $100,000 a year in reduced claims, they would do it. They don't have the data.
It's a very important point, Adam. I think, if you think about the potential risk of side effects, let's say we don't know, and you have this great drug, and it is, as I'm saying, increases the risk for pancreatitis, gastritis, gallbladder disease. If it does do that, and now they end up having to pay for the problems that arise from people taking the drugs, it is an issue that I don't think they're preventing. And also, obesity is a contributing factor, but so is pollution, to all-cause morbidity, mortality. There's no way that insurance company, smoking, it does change the way they think about it, but it's not enough for them to say we're going to get involved in every preventive tool or technique that's available.
There's obesity, but is it a disease?
That's the problem. Is it's not, there is morbid obesity, but being overweight is not necessarily, and particularly since, let's say they look at the population and they say, oh, 75% of the population now is technically obese. So are we insuring against obesity, which is now a normal part of life? Like everyone's technically overweight. And so are we, is our job to take care of every problem that arises? I don't know what the answer is. I guess for me though, I still feel like people are, there's a certain amount of personal responsibility that I think we should expect. I do feel like if people are able to, then they should be held to a certain standard where before going on medications like this, they've gone through a complete trial. They've given it a good go. It didn't work. And, and now we can help them lose, the extra 5 or 10. But I think that the good news about it is that I do feel like there will be cheaper drugs. I really do. I think that, I think they'll figure that out. I will mention one other small detail, and this is not to encourage people to be overweight, but over the age of 70, there is a slight advantage to having a few extra pounds in terms of, again, all-cause mortality, right? People with a little extra weight tend to survive crises that they may be confronted with a little bit better. Not obese, but, a few extra pounds. So.
Like how so? But explain.
Why does it work? So let's say you're 5 pounds overweight, 7 pounds overweight.
Let's say you're 25 pounds overweight.
Well, I think that's overweight. I think when you're dealing with 25 pounds that you can't get rid of and you've got a gut and, your HbA1c is elevated, which is a big marker that we use for determining glycosylation, which is how much glucose is attached to your red blood cells. That checks it over, let's say, 3 months. If we see that you're pre-diabetic, you are obese, you have a heart disease risk in your family, or we've got a CT scan, we find that you have primary calcium score is elevated. We just know that you've got all the reasons. Every duck is, being lined up against you. You have to start removing those risk factors. And again, I have patients where, they've been on these medications, their blood sugars have dropped, their cholesterol has dropped, their blood pressure has dropped because they've lost the weight. It's doing some incredible things and they're happier. Another risk factor from Ozempic that just came out, this was last week, was that there seemed to be an increased risk of suicidal thoughts. Now, I have not seen that. I have seen a lot of
I'd like to see that.
I've seen a lot of happy patients, but they're saying that it has increased some of those thoughts. And it may be because if you are, the drug is centrally acting. It works in your brain as well as increases metabolic function, but it works inside the food addiction centers. So it may be that it's having some action that heightens somebody's awareness that the reasons that they're overeating is because they're depressed, and perhaps Ozempic increases that perception, right? We've seen that with other medications that sometimes we think are doing a good thing, but it actually makes people more aware that there are problems. So
I think it's because a lot of people that are vastly overweight think that if I was only thin, everything would be okay.
Right.
And then they get thin and they realize they're crazy.
Right. Right. I think that's a very, very
that depends where does the suicidal ideation fit in the journey of weight loss?
And I think that it's another flashing yellow light in this love affair that we're having with pharmaceuticals, and where I've spent, my entire career looking for natural ways for people to get to the same point, right? Without taking without taking a drug, or at least if they're taking the drug, optimizing their health. Because at the end of the day, we are really in the game of optimization.
Right.
And if I can optimize a patient, and Adam, we've talked about, I do believe that, sort of the natural lifespan and runs to about 120. I do believe we'll get technology behind us that will push that forward. I don't think we're there at the moment, but I do think that we do have a natural ability to extend our health span, what I like to call our sage span, because it's the time, our wisdom years between, where our health span and our lifespan is, and we're supposed to be using those intelligently. It does take a bit of work, but I do think that optimization, if we use pharmaceuticals, if we use supplements, if we use all the technology we have, that's got to be the future of, where we are. And that's really the focus of my practice at this point is, how do we optimize health? How do we increase health span and lifespan? And how do we make sure that people stay healthy and vigorous and vital, well into their 90s, hundreds? I think it's entirely reasonable. I think it's possible. I think we're seeing it. And I think for the people who want to take that journey, there are a lot of tools in the toolbox, testing tools and treatment.
So, Richard, everybody's going to want to know where to contact you. So where should they look?
They can look at Firshein Center, go on the website.
Can you spell it for them?
Yes. So FIRSHEIN center.com. And that's the best place to look up practice and, say hello.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's absolutely a
fantastic.
pleasure. And
my pleasure.
Really thrilled to finally meet you, by the way. I know you've been a really inspiring figure for,
thank you.
We're, for most of my life. So I really enjoy the having this opportunity, and thank Adam for doing all he does. I've really become just enamored with his work and his depth of knowledge and experience is really something that he humbly, keeps to himself. But if the word is getting out, I'm just letting you know.
Thank you so much.
I think so. I think I've known him for like one
year. We know each other for many help
yes,
spans.
I know you two have, and I'm happy to be just invited into the group.
Well, we're gonna get together soon. I think you're fantastic, and I hope everybody, you can have a line around the block, which I'm sure you have already.
I'm looking forward to talking more, and I really appreciate your questions, and really very insightful.
Thank you.
And probably the best conversation I've had. I really loved the back and forth.
I just thought he was fabulous, and the reason for that, he was fabulous because he scanned so many, methodologies, practices.
So many dimensions.
Many. And I mean, I think he's a little conservative, but I kind of like that, like you could actually go on a diet and not take Ozempic, but very, very reasonable and warm and no attitude. And
a great educator. He likes to bring people along. And look, I don't disagree with him. I don't think you do either, that
not at all.
People can't outsource their personal responsibility to the government or to an insurance company.
Right. And I finally understand now why insurance companies don't want to cover it. I think it's just horrific, but whatever. He was very, I'll say he was just lovely. He is a
lovely person. I knew you'd enjoy him, and I think
I just loved him.
We should definitely have him back.
Yes, we should, and we should definitely run over there and get our things tested.
Get your C-reactive everything tested.
I want everything tested now.
Before Faith and I go, I just want to remind you to subscribe to Jolty, follow us, listen on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends, make your enemies like you better, and get Jolty out into the world. We thank you.
Yeah, beam us up, babies. Ciao.
Beam us up. Keep us up.